It's a privilege to welcome you here for an evening with a brilliant young writer, Andrew Sean Greer. I should tell you that this building, the West India House, is the exact place in Old Amsterdam where the Dutch West India Company used to gather to govern New Amsterdam on the other side of the ocean. And the renovation of this building back in the 1980s was the trigger behind the creation of the John Adams Institute. We have this building to thank for our existence. Unfortunately, it's not our building, so we cannot hold events here as often as we would like. But our offices are just located on the other side, and we are proud to carry on the tradition that the building itself symbolizes. But the reason we are here tonight is that we have another great writer in our midst. In a moment, he will speak about his latest novel, which has been very recently and very beautifully translated into Dutch by his Dutch publisher, Antos. Thanks to Antos, we are able to have him here tonight, and we're very grateful for their cooperation. Bas Heijnen will act as a moderator tonight, and he will introduce our guest of honor and lead the interview after the talk. You in the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions too. I think we'll finish about 9:30, and then there is no intermission, but Andrew promised me to sign his books later on. For now, switch off mobile phones, and Bas, may I ask you to come?
I'll be very brief. I'm very thankful for the John Adams Institute for inviting me to moderate this evening, not because it's always a pleasure to do any writer here, but a few months ago I'd never heard of Andrew Sean Greer. And so I asked very pickingly, he said, well, I have to read the book first before saying yes. Well, I did, and I now can say Andrew Sean Greer is one of my favorite living writers. So that's why I'm so thankful to be here tonight. For those of you who are as ignorant as I used to be, Andrew Sean Greer published a book of short story, How It Was For Me, a couple of years ago, which was very well received. And after that, he published a novel, a very good novel too. I read that after his last novel, called The Path of Minor Planets, and I'm telling you, that's worth reading, looking out for. But his second novel, The Confessions of Max Tivoli, really meant his breakthrough in American letters, you could say, because of rave reviews. Among one of the reviews was written by John Updike, and well, you will know that John Updike is not only a great writer of novels, but also a very perceptive critic of other people's works. So when he writes a review of a fairly unknown young American writer and is so enthusiastic, you can well imagine what kind of effect that will have on the American literary scene. And well, like I said, this novel really lives up to its promise, and we'll discuss it later, and I'll ask Mr. Greer questions about it. But first, I think he will talk about how he became a writer, how he came up for the idea of this unusual idea for this book, a main character who lives backwards, who begins very old and ends up very young, and how he came up with this idea, and read some parts of his novel. So may I invite you to the stage and read?
Right, I'll make it taller for myself. Here's my water. This is a great honor to be here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the John Adams Institute for inviting me. It's all actually a great surprise even to be here in Amsterdam speaking before you. It's an incredible honor and a privilege, and to be with one of my favorite living writers interviewing me. And also to Anthos and to Anke Blumenstein, my translator who came tonight, who did such a beautiful translation. I feel like all the words that anyone reads in Dutch are very much hers, based on mine, but chosen by her. It's It's a great honor. I also brought a present for everyone tonight, which is my identical twin brother. I have brought him from the United States to share with you. Yes, we're identical twins, but I'm older by 4 minutes, so I'm able to boss him around, and so I made him come with me. Let's see, and we actually were last in Amsterdam together with our family when we were 12 years old, so we've shared these two experiences together, and I have to say I remember nothing of Amsterdam except women and windows was it. That's all I remember of Amsterdam. It was a very brief tour. It's one of those awful American family tours where you go to 10 countries in 10 days and you learn nothing about the world except what you expected to find in the first place. So I'm glad to be back. I wanted to, let me drink this. There, we're done. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got the idea for the book, which is the first thing that people want to know about it. It's a novel about a man named Max Tivoli, who was born in 1871 in San Francisco with the body of a 70-year-old man. And he gets younger throughout his life to the point that his parents actually predict how long he has to live. They know he has 70 years to live. So they give a little medallion for him to wear that says 1941, which is the year he's going to die, that he wears throughout his life. And it's not the kind of book that I would normally write. I'm not a fantastic writer, of fantasy. But I had the idea when I was walking around my house. I was working on my last book, The Path of Minor Planets, and I was, like most writers, trying not to write, and I was wandering around the house in the kitchen, and I was singing a Bob Dylan song to myself, which is the most unlikely answer to the question of how I got the idea. But if any of you are Bob Dylan fans, it's called My Back Pages, and it goes, I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. I'm sure he was not talking about a man aging backwards, but it's probably a song about the feeling of interior change and of feeling more carefree after being released from some maybe feeling of being old. But it doesn't matter what he meant. Immediately what came into my head was the idea of getting younger throughout your life. And I thought, well, that's a terrible idea. You can't write a book about that. You're supposed to write like Virginia Woolf. She wouldn't write about that. And then I realized, well, she actually did write a book about someone who changes genders every couple of years. So, okay, that's not a good example. And then I thought, no one will ever want to read a book about a man aging backwards. And then I realized not that many people were reading my other books anyway, so it didn't really matter. And I thought, well, what the hell, I'm just going to write it. It sounds like it'll be fun. And I actually put it aside for a while until I came up with the idea that, because I knew I wanted to write a love story. I think it's all I can ever write is a love story. And it didn't sound like one until I thought, well, he could meet the same woman and she wouldn't recognize him because he would be younger and he would possibly be more attractive and would have a better chance at getting her to fall in love with him. And what if this happened 3 times in his life when he was an older man and maybe in his 30s and then very young? What would that be like? And at what point would he love her? Would she love him? And how do we get people to love us? And what is it that is appealing? And I realized this is what I'm interested in, the process of aging and also sort of aspects of love that we don't expect. And that's when I thought, I'm going to have a novel. This will all come together. I hope. I was in a panic most of the time that, again, no one would ever read it. And I also occurred to me, I began to write it, setting it, I'll start it with a Bob Dylan quote, and then I'll have it set in the present day in San Francisco, and it'll be about a man born 70 years ago. And then I realized I would have to age the man backwards through the 50s, 60s, and 70s in San Francisco. And I just thought I really did not want to write about that part of time in San Francisco. I thought it had been covered pretty thoroughly, and a man aging backwards through that time wouldn't have any better perception of it. So I set it 100 years earlier. And I realized once I did that I also, it added something like a little fairy dust to it and made it possible, maybe there could be a man aging backwards. It's turned into more of a fairy tale, or at least a parable. It set it in the time of novels like The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is not a science fiction book, but a book of sort of a sort of thought experiment played out through literature. And I thought, okay, it's in the turn of the century. It's in the same time period as The Invisible Man and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when great writers were writing about different possibilities of the body and the mind. And I thought, okay, it also allowed me to write like a Victorian, which freed up a lot of possibilities, maybe as you'll see when I read. I think it's more Victorian than other readers do, simply because I was always in this panic that I was writing this bizarre book. But once it came out, I realized a lot of readers started writing to me about how moved they were and how grateful they were to read a book that felt like it was written to sound like a classic book in some way. It reminded them of books they'd read when they were younger, and which was kind of what I had wanted to do for myself when I wrote it, thinking no one would write it. I said, I want to write a book that will sit on my shelf and feel like a classic that I wrote, from the Victorian era. I think there's not a lot I need to set up about this scene. It's a sex scene, so that'll keep your attention, but maybe not the way you'll expect. We'll see. Well, you already know that Max is aging backwards. And the year here is, he's 17 years old, so it's 1888. But if he's 17, he looks like he's 53, because his age and the age he appears to be always adds up to 70. So then when later he's 20 years, when he's 20 years old, what am I trying to say? When he's 50 years old, he looks like he's 20. And so here, he's 17 and looks like he's 53. He's living in a house in San Francisco. There's a woman and her daughter who live in the flat below him, and they think he's the landlord, although he's the teenage son of the landlord. The women they're called the Levys, and it's Mrs. Levy, a widow, and her daughter named Alice, and he is in love with Alice. She's 14 years old. Again, he looks like he's 53, just setting it up. The only other thing you need to know, which might be a little complicated, but I'll just run through it and then you'll just forget about it, don't worry about it, is the Levys are Jewish and they can't perform any important tasks on the Sabbath, and that means that sometimes they need help from a Gentile to do things for them, which is Max. He does little tasks like lighting candles for them or turning off the gas, and they can't even ask for him to do them. They have to just say, isn't it cold in here? And then he has to light a fire. Usually their maid does this for them, and he's called a Shabbos Goy. It was very common at the time, and it still is in Israel. They have actually Gentiles doing a lot of things like watching the dams to make sure they don't burst, because you can't do that on a Saturday. But that's Max's job for them. If it doesn't make any sense, it's not that important. They just might refer to something. I think that's all you need to know. Mrs. Levy always let me know when Tilly would be gone. She had all kinds of ways, but mostly she left a card with a corner torn, and every Saturday when we returned and went through the silver card receiver in the front hall, I longed to find her little message there. The moment I found the card, I went downstairs and often as not discovered the two of them in some kind of desperate situation that needed the slightest help from a Gentile's hand to set aright. And one Friday evening, for instance, after I'd been dining with Huey on Market Street, where we'd glimpsed Mammy Pleasant, the voodoo witch, Maggie opened the door for me and showed me the card receiver, knowing I was always eager to find a message. I think she knew it had to do with a girl. I found the card with some excitement, but first I went to Mother in the sewing room and exchanged versions of our days, while her sewing bird held another golden gown so recently dyed widow black. I listened and nodded, and finally withdrew and raced to the Levy's door, but no one answered. I rang a few times and was about to give up when I heard a gleaming voice coming from around the side of the house. "Mr. Tivoli, we're out back." And there they were, sitting in the chill of the San Francisco summer night, dressed in their warmest clothes. It was a sad scene. They had dragged their parlor's tete-a-tete out onto the yard and were sitting on it doing embroidery by the light of the moon. Mrs. Levy wore beautiful furs I'd never seen before, one of those enormous hats that ladies wore in the 80s, a dark tornado of feathers, and pale suede gloves that did not match. Alice was also in fur, a thin sealskin much too large for her, and a fur cap that made her eyes in moonlight seem like precious things brought round the horn. They dropped their threads and laughed to see me. I discovered later they had been like this for hours. It was unclear what had gone wrong. They knew their maid was away visiting a dying relative, so Alice had lit the gas lights just before sunset, and they had sat down to a good briskety Sabbath meal. And then perhaps the gas cut out, or an open window brought a breeze. Every light went out, and they were thrust into cold and darkness. They had not even built a fire. So here they were, too tired to go and visit friends, but too bored to sit in a dark room, talking to the taciturn ghosts of my grandparents through the walls. They had gathered their warmest family furs, carried the tete-a-tete into the moonbright yard, and continued their evening's activities, laughing and telling stories to each other in the brisk night air. "I think I'll light your gas again," I said, having learned the way to phrase this thing. "Oh no," Mrs. Levy objected, this time more seriously than usual. "No, it's lovely like this. Bring a coat, Mr. Tivoli. And wouldn't a cup of hot coffee be wonderful, Alice?" "Yes, oh yes," Alice panted through her skins. I went upstairs and found my best frock coat with buttonholes of twisted black silk I thought might shine in moonlight. I boiled coffee and poured it into the electroplated oriental samovar set on the table. Outside, I saw that Mrs. Levy had moved from the sofa to stand in the spotlight from the moon, where her furs seemed to bristle with the instinct of its animal past. "How gorgeous you look, Mr. Tivoli," she said, leaning against a tree and smiling as if about to start an aria. I poured the coffee into the queer glass cups they owned, and the ladies dipped down with eerily identical flower-plucking gestures and began to sip. I made some mms of pleasure, and they laughed again, free to love the coffee they'd both been craving. Mrs. Levy motioned ghostily. "Please sit beside Alice. She's a ball of warmth." I couldn't. "This coat itches," Alice explained. "Please sit, Mr. Tivoli. You've worked all day and now all night." I don't think people own these tete-a-tetes anymore. Some minor god must have been punished for bringing them down to us. A tete-a-tete, such as the one I found wet with moonlight that evening, was a sofa shaped like an S, made of two armchairs facing in opposite directions but sharing a middle arm. So you must picture it, a couple sitting ear to ear, glove to elbow. So when I began to take my place as Mrs. Levy instructed and look straight at my befurred and itching Alice, I was closer to her than I'd ever been. The wind blew and a hair floated out from her hat, stretched into the air, and landed on my lower lip, sticking there like a fishing line. I felt the hook bleeding into my mouth. Alice did not seem to care or notice, but merely smiled. Mrs. Levy was posing against the tree, her fur falling open to reveal her scarlet departure from widowhood, which had taken place in the last few weeks. Jasmine bloomed around her. "Shakespearean again, isn't it, Mr. Tivoli?" I didn't dare move or speak, but stared straight at the mother, blinking. I noticed it was a full moon tonight, and her movements cast shadows along the grass as if it were bright day. And then luck broke over me. There was a sound from the front of the house, and Mrs. Levy bowed theatrically before doing the unthinkable, leaving her daughter alone with the neighbor, this kindly, elderly man. Alice said, "I think maybe I was born in the wrong time." "What?" I tried to speak softly, not wanting to detach the hair from my lip. She stared away from me to where the moon was cresting the trees, and then she said, "Tonight, for instance, I love it tonight." Well, yes, nothing modern, no kerosene lamps smelling things up or gaslight. It hurts your eyes. No groups of people crowded around the stereoscope or a piano singing another round of Grandfather Clock for heck's sake. I wish every night was just starlight and candles and nothing to do. We'd have so much time. I was afraid any minute she might turn around and the hair would fall away, uncoupling us, and I wanted to say something to keep her talking, looking at the moon, traveling back to her simpler age, but I could say nothing. I just kept still, looking into her eyes. She continued in her slightly hoarse voice, "It's hard to imagine such a different life. We think about light all the time. You know that when it got dark in winter and there wasn't much light, you'd have to do everything before sundown. Well, there weren't any street lights on country roads back then, were there? How frightening. And you couldn't read at night except by candlelight. And you probably saved your candles very carefully, not like us. You made your own. They were everything to you if you read books. And you had to read. What else was there to do? They had so few nice clothes they never went out. They didn't have parlors or nonsense like Wardian cases or kaleidoscopes or watching magic lantern shows. There wasn't any of that to do. There were just people. Think of that." Alice lay silent, and I worked up my nerve to say something. "They went to balls." She shook her head, still facing the moon. "I mean a long time ago. I mean before kerosene lamps, and I don't mean special evenings like balls. I mean evenings like this. Ones we like to kill with a parlor game." And then my young love looked at me at last, and my chest went cold with fear. How could anyone fall in love by gaslight, I ask you? "And yet they do," came a voice behind us. Her mother was back. Alice was still looking at me. "Was it like that, Mr. Tivoli? Candles and long hours in the evening when you were a boy?" "No," I said softly. "Mr. Tivoli isn't that old, Alice, really, and we had kerosene lamps when I was a girl, you know." Alice blinked for a moment and faced the moon again. "Too bad. I'm in the wrong time. I want all my nights to be like this." Mrs. Levy seemed to be smiling. "I do like the moonlight." Alice considered this. "The dark, too, in the cold," she said, "and the silence." The last word came almost as a command. We were silent. Alice closed her eyes and breathed in the night air, and this action, just the contraction of her shoulders under the oily gleam of the sealskin, detached the invisible hair. I was alone again. Mrs. Levy stood before me against a tree. She was looking up at the stars. You could see just her breath forming in the chill air before her face, a ghost mask. We were all breathing, all wearing these masks. It was like a play of some kind, with the bright moon in the furs and the hats. I don't know what it meant. I saw Mrs. Levy lower her head and smile. I saw Alice breathing open-mouthed up to the stars, her cheeks webbed with color. I saw my old hand resting against her sleeve, desperate to tap a code of some kind to her. I saw how the moon had dropped into her cup of coffee. It struggled there like a moth. And then I saw her lean forward, her mouth in a silent kiss, and as she blew on the furrowed surface to cool it, I saw the moon explode. Later that night, after I'd lit the gas lights, carried in the tete-a-tete and started a fire in the Levy house, after I'd lit the short-burning candles in their rooms, I went upstairs to find our maid Maggie standing like the sewing bird with a sealed note in her grip. "Max, it's more than I can bear. Come to the garden at midnight. Signed, the girl downstairs." Some things are so impossible, so fantastic, that when they happen, you're not at all surprised. Their sheer impossibility has made you imagine them too many times in your head, and when you find yourself on that longed-for moonlit path, it seems unreal, but still somehow familiar. You dreamed of it, of course. You know it like memory. So I didn't hesitate. I took the note from Maggie and threw it on the fire. I changed my clothes to finer things and blackened a wet handkerchief by wiping the day's soot from my face. I remembered the moon in a cup of coffee. She was there in the garden. The moon had set. I could only see the glow of white showing from under firs. She was sitting on a bench beneath the trees. The twigs cracked under my feet in a dark garden, and she stood, silently watching me approach. Off far away, a fire engine sang in steam. A night-blooming cactus in the yard was on full show for no one in particular. I came closer and I could hear her gasp. I could see her holding her hands together, and then, when I was close enough for her to see me clearly, she took my arm and whispered something before she kissed me. I was still and quiet and shocked. Seeing my frightened eyes, the widow Levy was unable to hold in her laugh. She leaned back her head, and out it came, that string of pearls. Reader, I was 17 years old. Dear Mrs. Levy is dead now, buried south of San Francisco in the Jewish part of Colma. She died in her 70s after a prolonged illness in Pasadena, where her good daughter tended to her almost daily. Her skin became spotted and pale, and she allowed no visitors in her last days. She took to wearing her old widow's veil when her lawyers would come with documents for her to sign. She died without a penny to her name, and I picture an older Alice weeping by her mother's bed, holding a hand so thin that the rings no longer fit her fingers, the cold hand of my first lover. So I will be discreet. We must be gentle with the dead. The dead can say nothing for themselves. I will only tell you that she was kind and generous with me over the weeks we spent together in the darkness of the garden, and more than once in the midnight dangers of our South Park. She was confused and touched by the innocence of old Mr. Tivoli, and I think she took my trembling and moodiness for love, because after we were done and I lay shivering and gasping on the ground, Mrs. Levy would stare at me, and just for a little while, her eyes would star over in tears. She was a woman, not a girl, and though she had often been lonely, our nights were not desperate ones for her. They were simply a little honey for my heart, as she always whispered in my ear. Mrs. Levy, you never said it, but you probably loved me. You were kind to me, and I treated you badly, and in some hell you are all smiles today, measuring my private seat of fire. But why did I do it? Why, when my poor eyes squinted into the garden and saw not my sweet Alice's face among the fuchsia, but her mother's, did I not step back into the house? No one would have been hurt. It could easily have been construed as nerves, or better still, propriety calling for nothing further to be said of women in dark gardens. And nothing magic happened. The strands of starlight did not bind me to the spot. I could have left at any moment, but I was young. She thought I was an old businessman with a butterfly heart, but I was an ordinary boy of 17 who had never known what it was to smell a woman's hair that close, or feel a hand brushing his skin, or see a face unlatched with longing. It is almost another kind of love, being loved. It is the same heat, but from another room. It's the same sound, but from a high window and not your own heart. Brave or carefree people will not understand. But for some of us, the young or old or lonely, it might seem a palatable substitute and better than we have. We're not in love, but we're with someone in love, and the spare dreams of their days are all for us. Think of it, I had never been kissed, and I had no sense from my life as an old man that I would ever be touched or loved by a woman. I was unprepared for my own body. Huey's books had taught me what was what, but not what I might feel, and it all happened quicker than my dull mind could handle. From the moment Mrs. Levy took my arm under those trees, she moved without doubt. My very presence there meant I was willing, and I, heavy with doubt, could not keep up with her hands and kisses and her little whispers like folded birds placed in my ears. I could not keep up with the heat under my skin, or the scrape of her nails as she undid my shirt buttons, and I was bare to the night. The body, that pale spider, stuns the mind. It wraps it up in silk and hangs it from a corner so the body is free to go about its business. And I awoke to find myself lying in the phlox, hardly able to breathe, while Mrs. Levy sat above me, glad-eyed, lunarly bare-bosomed, stroking my hair and whispering, "You're a good man, Max, don't worry. You haven't touched a woman in a while, have you, Max? You good man." I was Mr. Tivoli on the steps and in the mail, but I was Max in her arms. Dear Max, handsome Max, strong and eager Max. I'd never heard my name said so many times in so many ways, all of them tender and good, as if that name, which had always tasted of hard tack in my mouth, were so rich it could only be indulged in quietly, carefully, within the secret antechamber of my ear. It was the first and one of the last times I heard my name said like that, because though women have gasped a name into my ear, it has seldom been Max. Sammy, have you heard it yet? You've had so many Sammys said to you, the "Get in here, Sammy," the "Aren't you a laugh, Sammy," the "Come out and play, Sammy," the "Don't bother me, Sammy." But are you old enough reading this to have heard the very different and surprising Sammy that comes from a girl in love? For once someone is not calling you or informing you or addressing you at all. It is not talk. She is saying it for her own pleasure, because though you are there before her, saying your name calls forth not the past Sammys she's held, but a future Sammy she imagines still kissing her like this. So Mrs. Levy conjured up a future Max, a strong man always lying in the phlox and breathing hard, and I was so unused to the feeling that I accepted him. I became him for a while, for I still answered her notes, and after a time recognized the signal of shades in her window, one up, one down, a wink in the night. For young men in old bodies, my God, isn't that reason enough? Thank you.
Well, you have got a taste of the book. One thing I admire of you as a writer is the immense amount of risk you took writing this book. I don't know if you, it sounded like you were conscious of it yourself, yes. I think. First, of course, there's the conceit of the book, the idea of a man going backwards, which sounds highly attractive if you tell it but it also sounds like a bit of a gimmick. So,
yes.
were you not at one point thinking, well, how do I make this into this idea, which is attractive, into literature in a sense? So what was the appeal for you of the idea?
That was the problem, is it sounded too much like just a gimmick and the kind of book I would never read. Mm-hmm. And I have to go back and sort of rewrite it for myself and realize that it was actually one of many novel ideas on a sheet of paper, and I have lost the sheet and don't know what the others were. I wish I did. And I think I went back and looked at it, and I found my last book was much quieter and took place over a long period of time, and it had to do with the passage of time and opportunities of love. And I realized, okay, I'm going to write the same themes. And I can use this just as an outline, as a structure, and then I can just forget about it. And I can overlay a real story, or I hope I can. But you're right, it was a panic. It sounded like it was going to be a disaster from day one. And I would send pages to my agent, 50 pages at a time, saying, stop me now. Stop me right now. I can do something else. I can wait tables, but I don't want to be working on this for 10 years and have it be just a disaster. It was, I was lucky that he would say, keep going, but cut these pages. Yeah, he would lead me along. But yeah, it was scary.
But afterward, looking back when you were writing, probably were not that conscious of why exactly you chose that idea, the starting point of this man growing backwards. But afterwards, when you finished the novel, did you have a more clear idea of what was the appeal of this conceit, you could say, of this man being, I would just call it, dislocated from himself all the time?
Oh, it's hard to say. I'm going to try to say something that doesn't sound like a soundbite. That's what's hard. I think looking back, the great appeal, well, maybe I can answer it this way. When I would sit down and try to write about him, I would simply put myself at that age, which was I probably felt very dislocated from my own body. For instance, 17 Mike was there, wasn't a splendid year for me. I felt much older than my peers who seemed to be having a great time cavorting around in high school, and I was just very bookish and sort of out of sorts, and it was that feeling, which I thought was a real feeling, that I wanted to write about. Or being in love with someone who is much more capable and not at all aware of you, because you're somehow hidden from them. You're somehow invisible to them, and they don't see you seriously as a possible love.
It's one of the things John Updike wrote in his review, what I think is a wonderful phrase summing this up, this feeling was this, that you used this conceit of this man growing backwards, that it was just a heightened version of the strangeness of the muted disharmony of being human.
Yeah.
And the sense of the muted disharmony. I think that's a very nice phrase, because it's this sense of not this terrible tragic feeling, but this feeling of that you never connect very well with whom you're supposed to be somehow, in social situations or
well,
in
of
love.
course, he says it better than I ever could say it, because he's John Updike. Right, the feeling that you never, and also people you meet, like it's like somehow you never quite, you think you're going to land somehow, but you're like some kind of hummingbird that never quite sits down. You're just always in movement, and especially because you come into other contact with people who are having the same experience, no matter how they present themselves. And that's, of course, what novels are about, and so that appealed to me.
And that's what becomes a very real experience when you read the novel, that
I'm
though
so glad.
you're not a man, an older man growing younger, you still recognize this feeling of this dislocation, which is what Updike says is quite human. But it also creates a secret self, I think, in your context with people, especially the people you love, actually. And I think that's one of your big themes, I think, not only in this novel, but also in the first novel, that is this kind of secret self, which is always trying to connect, but doesn't know how, or
Oh, I love that, the secret self.
well, I'm just making it up, but
I'll use that later. But I think, well, isn't it true? I mean, when you find yourself like you have a new love, and you sort of kind of figure each other out, and then you start calling each other secret pet names with each other, and you have this own version of yourselves. You sort of make up versions of yourself for this romance, and then something goes wrong, and you break up, and you forget that person you were, and you can't believe you were ever with this person, and it comes apart because it was something that you created together that was not a full part of yourself, but it's still something beautiful about it.
And Max gets 3 times, well, unlucky you could say, but he has 3 chances of reinventing himself for the same woman.
Right, yeah. I don't want to give anything away. Yeah, it's true.
Well, you did, I think, already.
I did, I already gave something away.
But that's a kind of fantasy of how, but your view of love seems, you could say, is rather tragic, in the sense that it's always, the longing is there, but the realization of love always somehow falls short of the illusion of it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I remember being, once I must have been 22, and I was at a table with friends of mine, all in our early 20s. This was in Montana, in far western, Wild West America. And so there weren't many people around, and I looked around and I realized that each of us at the table was in love with another person at the table, all the way around. None of them were in love with me, and
Your thought.
and I thought, this is awful.
Yeah.
This is just so awful. I have to get up and walk away from this table because this is the saddest thing I've ever seen. But I couldn't because I was in love with someone at the table, and I was kept waiting. You know, maybe he'll notice me. Maybe everything will change any minute. Something might change. And we were all there at the table having a terrible time with people we didn't get along with, jealous of that person, because we kept thinking it might change. And at 22 it might, but it didn't.
Well, in 20 years, all these people will come up to you. You know, I was terribly in love with you at that time.
That's true. That's exactly it. Oh, well, that's the other thing. It's you know, it's a book. The first sentence of it is, "We're each the love of someone's life," and I think it sounds like a romantic sentence, maybe. And I actually read on the internet that someone had sent a bouquet of flowers to their sister who's getting married, and it said on it, "We are each the love of someone's life." And I don't think it's very romantic, because when I thought about it, I thought, but you're not with that person.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think back, or at least when I think back, and you think of, okay, people you were in love with, and then you realize, okay, there was someone who I meant more to them than I realized at the time, and they probably still think about me.
Mm-hmm.
Not in some grand way, but in some very private, like a 14-year-old way that they keep to themselves as like an early idea of love, as a very sad thing. And they're probably still your friend because they were in love with you.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise they wouldn't have been friends with you, and you realize they're in your life because of some early, and it starts to form everything, even though it never quite expresses itself.
But that seems to echo another thing in the book, is that the moment is never quite right, in a sense. You always have a sense of missing someone, of being not only some moments can be complete in a sense, but a lot of chances in life are missed, opportunities are lost, or decisions are made that are regretted. And also in your first novel, I think.
Yeah, a lot in that one.
And you put that into a kind of context which you hardly can escape as a kind of view of life. That, I mean, this book is about very much about the passing of time. The other book is, your first novel is very much human relationships within a kind of cosmic context, you could say, because they're all scientists watching meteors and comets and looking at the sky, and the universe is very much present in the book. So you have this sense of, I think, this kind of overview of what life is, and that doesn't seem to me very hopeful in a sense, or perhaps hopeful, but not very optimistic.
I know it doesn't. I've had people come up to me and say, worried about me after
Mm-hmm.
reading some of my books, but I think that it's more, maybe they're somehow cautionary, or
Mm-hmm.
that there's something also that or at least I think of this book, is that it's I think a very sad book, but that Max writes in a way that he is maybe sensitive to, because he's this strange kind of creature, he's sensitive to the world in a way other people aren't, and so he can notice sort of beautiful aspects that he can, something that might seem overwritten in another book, but that he can talk about seeing the moon in a cup of coffee like a moth, and that he's sort of noticing it, and there's a pleasure to it. I think this is what people write about Proust too, that it's a constant sort of an enjoyment of life, but not in a Pollyanna way,
Mm-hmm.
but in a sense it's going to pass. You can enjoy it mostly through memory and never quite at the moment when it's happening, but it's still necessary to capture it, even as it's passing by.
That seems in one way very quite un-American, you could say.
It could be, yes,
Because
it
it's
does.
not this optimistic, this sense of being able. I think there's two strains in American culture. One is very a sense of predestination, like Hawthorne, the writers who are more Puritan, the writers with the Puritan tradition who are think your life is made before you, and the other sense of the other strain is that you are able to reinvent yourself every time, whenever you want. More Oprah kind of. To mention one of your favorite programs, the Oprah kind of being able to reinvent yourself, to make life in a sense but your view seems somewhere in between, I think, in the sense that, well, not in between, but people are not able to make their own lives, I think, in this book. in the big sense.
Right, yeah. It's true. I mean, I also was thinking about it when, at the time period, at sort of the turn of the century was this time when there's all this sort of people in America arriving, reinventing themselves, or are changing. There were, I mean, gay people pretending to be straight, and black people pretending to be white, and Jewish people pretending to be Italians, like the Marx Brothers. There was all this slippage. You could kind of come up with a new version of yourself. I'm not convinced everyone was happier that way. But they got to reach some other level and got to do some other reinvention. I don't know, I'm fascinated by it. I'm disappointed when I look at people's lives and they never came up with a new version of themselves. But then sometimes I'm frustrated when they do and they leave me behind, for instance. So,
but there's also a sense of being a victim, not only of circumstance, but also of time itself, of being, you are, well, I wouldn't say obsessed, but you are highly fascinated by the process of people changing, of getting older, also in your first novel, you have lapses of a couple of years every time the people meet, and they have changed. They have grown, they have become bald, or they have become aged, so there's silver in their hair or whatever. But that's a, and they also change in an interior way somehow, and that's the kind of process. They don't seem to be conscious of them, but the writer is, very much so. You are very much conscious of that process, and that seems also. Is that something you, in one way, you seem to relish in it?
Well, it's true. It's true that I like, for instance, in this book, I couldn't wait for some of the characters to get 80 years old, and to make them old somehow. But I don't necessarily. I had one person ask me in America a particularly annoying question, which was he asked me, as a gay man, do you think you write about someone getting younger because gay men all want to be younger? And I didn't. I was infuriating somehow, because I said no, not at all. Actually, a lot of the time, I see friends of mine, if I haven't seen them in a couple of years, and you see how much you're just, they're so old, and it's sort of exciting because they have. It's a relief. We've all left behind our 20s, and we don't have to do the things that you feel.
You tell them that?
No, maybe I try to communicate it somehow. Like, we don't have to go out drinking tonight. We can watch a video. And they're like, okay, good, because I don't want to. You feel, okay, it's over. The young part is over. Or sometimes when you meet a much older person, and I know that they don't see themselves. When they look in the mirror, they don't see a 70-year-old person. They see probably someone in their 30s, the way that they see themselves, and I try to think of how they imagine themselves. And that meeting for the first time, I think, well, they've been 70 forever. It's always tempting. The way my grandmother was always 60, even though I'm sure she was 40. When I first met her, I was 2, but I kind of find it interesting to play that game with people. I'll play it with you right now.
Okay. Well, I was quite an athlete. I still think of myself like that. But the other risk you took in the book is a question of style. I think you have a very literary, lush style of writing, which is not un-American, I would say, but it's most writers, a lot of writers seem to shrink away from taking this risk of being lyrical, and they choose quite stark realism, or to leave a lot of not being too descriptive, but to leave as much as they can to leave out. And you seem to take risks in style too, to have a kind of pathos in your style, and is that something you really that comes naturally, or do you work on that, or is it something? Are the writers you like that? I mean, like you mentioned Proust, and he's a dangerous writer, I think, but you come. I must say you managed to come away with it, and
thank God. Thank you.
You took a risk, but like I told you. It's something you manage quite well, but it's quite risky because before you know it, you're writing. You get swept away with your own style.
Right, and it becomes purple.
Purple prose, yeah.
And I think I've always been on the edge of it, and probably not always successfully. And so I've always sort of longed to. I think also I was always a huge fan of fiction that was before 1960 probably. So it's a lot of books that are. Oh, you know, I loved Faulkner. I mean, what could be more purple than that? I haven't read him in a while, but I just so enamored of it. And I would write essays in high school that would be imitations of him. And the teachers would be furious because we're taught in school to count the adjectives in our sentences and to get rid of them all.
Yes.
Because they're superfluous.
Here too, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I kind of understand why, because it's a cheap way of getting a description rather than actually attacking it with a few words. But I just was always sort of longing to do it, and that was the huge risk of it. Not necessarily writing about a man aging backwards or history, but it was this style. And I guess the inspiration was Lolita, where he pulls off, because it's from passion, because it's not an academic indulgence, it's meant to come from, I mean, it is that too, I think, in Lolita, but it's just this beautiful passion, and an ugly one as well, that comes out in all of his language, was the inspiration. And I thought, if it always comes from this great love, or a love for this, for his son, then it's allowed.
You write quite beautiful about ugly things too, about people are they're not sugary kind of people. They are quite. Alice is quite. You could say the main woman in the character who is loved by Max in the novel is quite. You could say she's quite egotistic in a sense.
Yes.
And Max too himself too.
Yeah.
So you don't have with your style, you don't take on only nice characters or romanticized characters at all. So there's a quite discrepancy between the style and the things you write about, I think.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say that. Actually, we talked earlier about Edmund White, who was my thesis advisor in college, and I remember him very specifically saying, why are you talking about ugly things with ugly language? Don't you know that you should talk about gangrene on a leg as if it were a white column being wreathed with ivy? That's how you talk about gangrene, because that the other way is like having a thunderstorm happening when someone's angry. It's too obvious. And that was an incredible piece of advice.
Oh, yes.
Because it seemed to be more human to have a sort of mixed experience of it.
I read one review of your first novel. It says, it's a very good novel, but the characters are not very likable, which really distracts from the quality of the novel, and that seems an odd way, but I don't think...
I've read that review too.
Okay.
Yeah, I've actually had readers come up to me and say that they didn't like Alice, or they didn't like Max, that he was a whiner, that he should have just moved somewhere else. Why didn't he move somewhere else?
Well, I think there's always a risk if a lot of writers are admired for writing about really bad people or really good people, but the people in between, like most of us are much more of a challenge, I think, and for the writer, but also for the reader, I think, because then the characters become really close to who you are yourself. Perhaps at this point there's a question from the audience.
Shall I try?
Yeah, wonderful.
Bob Dylan fans will know sentence, time is an ocean, but it ends at the shore. A lovely phrase. You seem to be very obsessed with time. And I keep hearing on the radio that Americans work 500 hours more per year than do Europeans.
Oh.
So we have a lot more time to Bob.
Yes.
Do you have any observations to make about this? With the spectacle and the Americanness of aspects in your book, and in Europe you did time, maybe I'm asking the wrong question, but it's the problem when you're a writer. People start asking questions that have nothing to do with the book.
No, I'm happy to.
See if you have any observations.
I mean, I think often, one of my great frustrations with friends in my life when I watch them go on is I see them missing so many opportunities to enjoy their other friends when you, or when it's finally sunny out, or that sounds like a childish response, but it is. I mean, I have a lot of time in my life, but I've made a lot of sacrifices to set it up that way, to have a writer's life and not a 9-to-5 life, and so I love it. Of course, I spend a lot of it doing writing, but I love it, and so I try to encourage my other friends to quit their jobs or leave their spouses, but I do, because I do have a sense of somehow slipping away. I don't know what's American about it or European.
Mm-hmm. Are you an instinctive writer in the sense, do you do a lot of research? Because this novel there's a lot of place names, historical facts. Are you researching that, or is it something you keep in your mind and use when it comes up while writing?
Oh, that would be wonderful. I did do a lot of research,
Mm-hmm.
and then I threw most of it away. As my translator will tell you, the manuscript she first saw was 100 pages longer than this is, because when you do research, it's so tempting to put it all in to show off what you've learned, and then it destroys the work itself.
Did you translate the 100 pages?
No, she waited.
Okay.
Wisely.
Yes.
No, she didn't have to waste her time. But so a lot of it was research I was specifically doing all of the time. But some of it is invented. There's a part where he talks about his mother sitting in a chair, and that she's a woman who lived. She was a great beauty in the 1860s when women wore bustles, or 1870s. And it's now the 1890s when bustles are out of style, but that she still sits. Women had to sit like this, right? Because this giant bustle, they had these chairs with no arms on them they would sit in, and that she still sits this way, even though she doesn't have a bustle, isn't anything from research, but it was kind of something I thought might be true, because you see people today stuck with mannerisms from their past, and certainly fashions from their past. And I think then it says that, of course, now women who used to sit that way are all dead. That it's something that is lost, that we don't come across that. That was sort of imagined and invented, and was more fun than actually putting research in, but is impossible to know if it's true.
Do you keep notebooks of all the facts?
Yes, I kept all the notebooks, and it's been useful for the next book I'm working on. Is also historical, and I get to pour back through it and see if there's something that I didn't waste my time on all the...
Okay. Another question?
I read a lot of poetry. It's when I sit down and write, I find poetry is the best way to inspire an image from which I can build a paragraph, and so I spend a lot of time doing that. I think I'm actually a terrible poet in the poetry form, so I sort of spend it on prose. Thank you for saying that, but I haven't tried in years to write real poetry, because I think I become poetry has to be even closer. I become too sentimental and obvious in a poem, and it has to be even more carefully balanced on that edge of emotion and sort of obscuring it. And I don't think I have that talent. I write every day. Well, I travel to Europe, which is lovely, but normally I write 9 to 5 every day, or I have to write 3 pages, and that sometimes will take me into the night, 3 good pages, if I really hate myself that day, and sometimes I can get it done very quickly, and then I have the rest of the day free, and I can go see a movie, or call up a friend and tell them to quit their job and join me somewhere. But that's it, and I try not to get too attached to habits and think that there's something magical about a certain chair or a pen. It's very tempting to do that, or think, you know, I have to drink a glass of wine before every sentence or something. I mean, these would be bad habits. I went with a friend while I was in the middle of writing this. A friend of mine was going to Greece and Turkey for some sort of law school, and she wanted me to come with her. And I did, and I thought, oh, it's going to be awful. I won't be able to write because I don't have all the magic things around me. And it took a while to convince myself I could do it. And then it was great to realize that it was really about forcing myself into a chair and not about any sort of spell that I could cast.
A question you would normally ask a writer is how do you handle bad reviews? But in your case, I would like to ask, well, how do you handle praise? Or this in this quantity? Because a lot of writers are killed, I think, by too much praise.
What do you mean killed? That they?
Just a little warning. No,
you mean that they become like it destroys their own writing because they become?
They become too attached to the spotlight, you could say, or they become overconscious of writing. They have to follow up this book that is praised by John Updike. I don't want to make you nervous, but do you have any mechanisms to ward off this kind of?
Maybe it's incredible self-doubt. It's because I feel very funny being even here talking about it, and to be taken this seriously often makes me very nervous. Which is how I felt when the review came out by John Updike. I thought, he's taking me so seriously. And I wrote it to be taken seriously, but then it's hard, I can't take it seriously myself. You know, because then you become one of these madmen. So I try to, I don't know, I mean, I think that writing can only happen when you have incredible self-doubt, because then you stop yourself from writing these horrible things. You know, you think you write something, at the end of the day you think I'm a genius, I'm going to drink some beer and look at it tomorrow and I'm going to be so pleased, and you look at it and you hate it the next morning, and I think it's very important to hate it.
Yes, I think so.
You think, don't you think?
Yeah, that's true.
And change it, and then you think, I'm a genius, and you go out and then, so I think that's still there.
It's a sense of dislocation, which is
right, yes,
very useful in a book.
You're totally blind to actually what's going on in the book.
Yeah.
Which is also why it's so nerve-wracking when reviews arrive, because you really don't know what you've written.
No. Another question. Yeah.
Maybe a somewhat peculiar question. Should we read something special in the name Tivoli? To me it means a park in Copenhagen.
Yes.
How did it come such a name? Why Tivoli? Why not the real American name?
Well, his father is Danish, and he changed his name to Tivoli when he came to America because he wanted to have a sort of musical name. So it's actually a name that his family invented, which was pretty common for people coming to America because Americans could not pronounce most things. Still can't. But I picked it, that's just the excuse in the book. I picked it because I wanted a name that would sort of bring up a wonderland. I felt like I needed to create some sort of atmosphere without ever making it any kind of a fairy tale. I wanted to have different elements, like the occasion of his birth is a little unusual, that would make it seem possible to the reader. And I wanted a name that seemed particular, not an everyday name, but something that would stand out, like Dorian Gray. Although maybe that's a more ordinary name now that I think about it, but it's something memorable. Yeah, but I wanted that sort of magical feeling. And I had such fond associations with the Tivoli Gardens. I guess it's actually an Italian word, but yeah.
Does it mean, now that you brought the word wonderland, I think where how you can put Alice?
Oh, yes. It actually, I hadn't quite realized I'd done it until partway through the book, that I named her Alice, and then that, of course, there's this sort of getting taller or getting smaller, and then I was so happy with it. Because often I'll write the book and then I'll change all the names of all the characters. because sometimes I'll name them after people I know, and then I have to go through and search and replace. But and some of the characters here I also changed, just so they wouldn't all sound alike. But yeah, I was very happy with the Alice as a sort of secret compartment in the novel that people could maybe get and enjoy.
Do you live with your characters? Like I talked to Elmer Leonard once, and he really keeps track of his characters, even when he finished the novels in which they're in. So he says, "Oh, today is 15th of March. So and so is coming out of prison now, and he's a character of his books." And I really believed him, because some of his characters could come back in other books, and they have aged in between.
Yes, yeah.
Is that a feeling you recognize, or are they very much a collection of words for you, or associations?
I do. I mean, I'm trying to shed the book but I do, especially. Well, I live in San Francisco, and so I'm very conscious when I walk around. I feel like I'm walking over the graves of my characters at times, especially April 22nd was the anniversary of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, which is in the book. He's actually not in San Francisco when it happens, but I was very moved, so to speak, that morning, and you can go in San Francisco that day and meet all the survivors of the earthquake, and to go and meet them, I sort of was touched in the crazy imagining that Max would have known these people or something wild. But yeah, when I walk around, I think about them and I try to put them in the setting, and I think it's the same mind of just being a novelist, that you train yourself to think of them as real people for so long, it's hard to let go.
A question about the coming elections.
Oh no! Yes, the European elections.
Are you a writer?
No more limousines.
Are you a writer tempted to be engaged, in the sense politically engaged at this time?
You mean in my writing?
No, not only in your writing, also to write, or perhaps writing articles or being participate or in literary circles or whatever. But
yeah, I mean, yes. I think I have to, because I think the art world is sort of, there's something at stake, especially right now in America, about freedom of speech, or the whole atmosphere seems to have changed in the last 4 years. So I don't think I seem to be a failure at writing anything particularly political. I become too strident and too shrill a voice, and I'm bad at it. But I do. For instance, there's a book that's coming out called The Future Dictionary of America, which a lot of American writers were asked to write a definition that is from the future. So it's a word that only exists sometime far in the future, and it's meant to benefit something called MoveOn.org, which is a progressive website giving money to democratic causes, and particularly in the next election. And it's astounding how many writers responded. Almost every writer I could think of joined it. And I'm not sure that would have been true 10 years ago, but there was a feeling like, okay, we're all together, we have to change it.
Also, looking at American newspapers and also the websites and how books are reviewed about Bush administration, or films like Michael Moore's films, it seems almost like a kind of, well, if you look at the internet, like a virtual civil war at this moment. America seems to be split right down the middle with very antagonistic opposites, I think.
Yeah, it could. I also think that the media presents it as if there were two even sides with exactly the same number of people, because that's how you want to see it. But I'm convinced that that's not true. That there is a Bush administration, and then there's everyone else. I just think if they were all told exactly what was going on, it would all be over in a minute. But
well, people here at the newspapers tell you that that when you think about it like that, you might be in for a surprise.
I know. I was surprised last time.
And you're from San Francisco.
I am from San Francisco, so we don't have a very clear view of the rest of the country, it's true.
Another question. No? Oh, one other? One last one? Yeah?
To go back to what you were talking about when you realized that you named Alice Alice.
Yes.
What, have you ever had anybody come up to you and say, oh, I love the way that you work this and this and this into your book and the imagery you use or the symbolism you use, and you have no idea yet? And it's
Yes, yes. Now, I ask you, if someone said that to you, what would your response be? Well, you would say, well, of course I meant to put that in there. I had a whole interview like that in Los Angeles by this incredibly brilliant man, Michael Silverblatt, who has a show called Bookworm that's brilliant. You can actually listen to it on the web. And he's an incredible reader, and he sat me down beforehand and he said, we're not going to talk about the publishing industry or about the history behind the book. We're going to talk about the language in the book and your favorite books and writing and reading in general. It's going to be scary and you have to look me in the eyes. And it lasted an hour, and everything he said had never occurred to me in the book. And I just kept saying, well, exactly, yes, exactly what I meant to say. And I was terrified until I'd actually, I heard that a poet, Anne Carson, had been on the show, who's a brilliant poet, and he had done the same thing to her, and she had said exactly the same thing. So I felt much better. But it's true, it happens all the time, but at least you get to feel, you know, that in some ways I'm only maybe just a reader of the book, that I would hope that I couldn't limit what it would be just because I had some idea in writing it. You know, I would want to write a book that was more open in its meanings, that it was a little free-form, because then it would mean it would last longer in some way or would touch more people. That would be what you would want to do. So it would be good for someone to say that, but then you don't want to admit that you didn't, because then it seems like it's not possible.
Last question, no? And I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
You too.
Oh no! Oh God.
Are you right?
Oh my dear Lord.
I didn't want to upstage you.
You certainly did.
Oh, well, this was a small one. I'm all right. I didn't break anything.
Well, the podium is too small. Oh, I'm sorry. I hope.
Oh, well, this is one.
Quite
I thought
interesting
I
ending.
might grab the table, but
Yeah.
I thought I might grab you.
I'm okay.
Are you okay? Well, very strange. But thank you, Andrew, for coming over to Amsterdam. I don't think it's awkward you came, because I think the words you brought us and the book, it was so fantastic that you had to be here, and I'm very proud that we were the first one out of America to have you here, and I'm very happy about that. Well, Bas, I hope you're okay.
All right, yeah.
But thank you for taking so much time to read in quite a short notice while finishing off your own book, which will be released next week. Very grateful for having you here. Thank you all for coming. There is one more event this month coming up before we have our summer break. That will be the June 23rd, with something completely different, nothing fiction-like, although it's about American politics. It's Walter Russell Mead who will talk together with Maarten Huygen in the Singelkerk. And I would like to invite you to come over there as well. But thank you all for coming tonight. And as I said, there will be books for sale outside the door, and there will be also drinks. So please stay a little while. Thank you for coming.